Hello everyone, my name is Dan Lee, and I'm here in the Sierra Miniature Studio, and today I'm going to be showing you guys how I assembled and painted this miniature radioactive waste vat. So to start this project off, you will need one of the Games Workshop Sector Mechanicus Ferratonic Furnace terrain pieces, and the sides are all a little bit different, but that doesn't matter because for this project they're all functionally exactly the same. So the first step is to take the 4 quarter-cylinder pieces and glue them together into 2 half-cylinder pieces. But make sure not to glue the 2 half-cylinder pieces together yet, as there's an intermediate step. Just make 2 pieces that look exactly like the one on screen. For the next step, I used a compass to mark an 85mm in diameter circle on a piece of plastic card, and then cut the circle out with scissors. Like so. Now that we have our plastic card disc and our 2 half-cylinder pieces, we're going to put the disc between the 2 pieces before gluing them together. So I take some super glue, and on each of these cylinder pieces you'll notice that there's a small indent about an inch from the top. I'm putting super glue in the indent. And I'm using super glue instead of plastic glue because super glue has a little bit more body to it and will therefore hold the plastic card disc a little bit better. So insert the plastic card disc into the 2 indents, and then take the other piece and put super glue in the same indents on this side. And now apply plastic glue to the sides. And you can use super glue for this whole thing, that's fine as well. I just find that plastic glue binds small pieces that are meant to fit together more effectively than super glue does, and it's a little bit cleaner too. There isn't as much glue that gets forced out of the sides and whatnot. And so once you've done this, just put the 2 side pieces together. So now that the plastic card disc is glued in place, you'll notice that there's still a small gap between the disc and the cylinder wall. And so I'm just going to go ahead and plug this with green stuff. And granted, this isn't the most elegant solution to do this. It's just, you won't actually see any of this green stuff in the end because it's going to be covered by several layers of resin. The point of putting this green stuff in is just, if you're going to be pouring resin over it, you can't have any holes, otherwise the resin will seep out while it's drying. So this is not a cosmetic touch, this is just something to prevent the resin from dripping out. And I'm just using the handle of the pliers here to sort of press it in and make sure that there's as much of a seal as I can make. So now it's time to pour the actual resin, and for this step I'm using Green Stuff World UV transparent resin. And in this video clip, this is actually my second coat of resin that I'm putting on, but I applied the first coat exactly as I'm applying this one. Just kind of going around, making sure the resin gets into all the little cracks on the sides, and just kind of covering the entire surface. Also, don't worry too much if this layer of resin is a little bit uneven or if there's a few bubbles or something, because this isn't going to be the final layer, so you won't actually see any imperfections in this layer of resin. Just try and generally get it kind of flat, but other than that, don't worry about it too much. As you can see here, I'm just kind of pushing it around, kind of making sure that it's, got more or less a solid coverage. And as I set it down, I noticed that I missed a spot, so I go back in to just kind of clean it up a little bit and make it a little bit extra smooth. So the next step is to take a UV light. And this Green Stuff World resin actually dries instantly under UV light, and that's important for this project because if there are any small holes in the green stuff where the resin drips through, you don't want to leave it to dry for a long time because more of it will progressively drain out. But if you dry it immediately, then this isn't much of a problem. As you can see on the cardboard there are a few little resin drips, but now that the resin is completely dry and I can touch it with my finger and it's hard, this is not an issue. I'm also just coming in from the bottom and making sure to dry up any of those little leaks from the bottom. So in order to make the radioactive waste in the vat bubble, we have to make some bubbles. So for this, I'm just taking some green stuff, and I just make a little ball in my fingers, and just roll it on a piece of cardboard. And the reason I'm rolling it on cardboard instead of the plastic or the vinyl cutting mat underneath it, or vinyl PVC, I don't know what the cutting mat is made out of, but anyways, I roll green stuff on cardboard because I find that it doesn't stick as much. In order to make balls, you have to have the green stuff actually roll over the surface that you're doing it on, because if it sticks, then the balls will become misshapen. So, yeah, I use cardboard. You can probably also use paper. But just most plastic surfaces, I find that green stuff kind of sticks to very well, and therefore you won't be able to get a smooth shape like a bubble because it'll keep getting pulled out of shape. Also, as these green stuff bubbles dry, they will probably flatten out a little bit on the bottom, and this is fine because you can cut the bubbles in half, or you can just leave them and put the flat side down. So now that I have all the green stuff bubbles, I have arranged them in a pattern, or I suppose lack thereof pattern, that I thought looked kind of random and good for some bubbles. So I just arranged them so I could get them into an order that I liked, and now I'm just coming through and putting a small dot of super glue down, and then putting the bubbles on the dot of super glue. And as I mentioned, each of these bubbles, as they dried, flattened out slightly on the bottom. So the reason they're not rolling around is because they are slightly flat, and that's the side I'm making sure to glue down, leaving the spherical side facing up, because that looks more like a bubble, obviously. As I mentioned as well, you can also cut these in half if you want a little bit more variation in size, but I found that I had enough different sizes to where when you put them down, they all kind of looked more or less random anyways, so I didn't think that was necessary for this. So now that all the green stuff bubbles are glued down, I do the final coat of resin with a Vallejo water texture, and you can totally just use the Green Stuff World resin for this as well. I just happen to be using the Vallejo water texture because I like its consistency a little bit better. When it dries, I think it dries a little bit more smoothly, and it doesn't have quite as many bubbles in it, so I just like the look a little bit more. However, for the sake of this project, you don't really need the Vallejo water texture. The Green Stuff World resin is much more important because of its property to dry instantly under the blacklight, which is really important to stop it from leaking in that earlier step, whereas this Vallejo water texture takes more than 24 hours to dry. So it wouldn't have done as good of a job on those earlier coats because it would have slowly drained out any little holes that we failed to patch with the green stuff. So that's just sort of my evaluation of those two resins, is that this one looks a little bit better but is a lot more temperamental, so you don't really have to use it at all. But I would highly recommend the Green Stuff World resin just for your general projects. So now to start painting it, I took the model outside, and I first actually put a 100mm base on the bottom, just cuz, and then I primed it with Chaos Black Primer, and then from the top down, I lightly sprayed it with Leadbelcher Primer. And the effect that this has is that, as you can see, it's still very dark on the bottom and in all the recesses and in the details, but then it's nice and shiny on the top. This is a really good way to just do metal in general, especially on terrain pieces. It's quick and it really adds a lot of visual interest. So now we take it to the airbrush booth, and for the first step, I'm going to be using Vallejo Game Air Silver, and I'm just going on all the 4 side panels and kind of spraying on the silver in a very blotchy pattern. And the purpose of this is going to look terrible. It's not meant to look good as is. We're going to be doing some other coats and stuff over the silver, so this will be more or less disguised. This is just to create some modeling and a little bit more visual interest later down the line. I'm also picking out, most of the time when there's a detail on one of these panels, like one of the little grates, or there's a little Mechanicum symbol over in the corner, I make sure to pick out those details specifically with silver, because it tends to help the eye focus on them a little bit more, as opposed to just the flat paneling. So for the next step, I'm using Vallejo Beasty Brown, and I'm applying this in the exact same way that I put the silver on the side panels, just putting it on in kind of a blotchy, mottled pattern, but making sure not to cover all of the silver. You can kind of blend the edges together, but you don't want to obliterate all of the work you just did. And I'm also not covering all of the Leadbelcher primer that I sprayed down too. The point is just to get sort of a gradient of colors. Also, I don't put the brown on in the same level of consistency, so like it's darker in some places and more opaque, and then some places it's a little bit lighter. This is all just to kind of create visual contrast. Also, I should mention that I seem to have lost the clip of the next step, in which I come in with charred brown and do this exact same method just to create even more contrast. And you will see the model with the charred brown applied. It's just you won't actually see me airbrushing that on. Just kind of go around the model, and there's really no right way to do this either. It's just kind of, you know, how you think it looks good. Also, unlike the silver, I'm actually going to apply the Beasty Brown all over the model too, not just on the side panels, to create rust in some of the recesses on top and on the bottom. So now that we have the charred brown, Beasty Brown, and silver applied to the side panels, I'm going to come in with some Vallejo chipping medium and spray all of the side panels with a coat of this. And it's a bit hard to see the Vallejo chipping medium on camera because it's clear, and it has a very weird consistency too. It's not really a liquid, it almost sprays out sort of like a paste, but hopefully you can see by the light, this is about how heavily I put it on. So the next step is to come in with Rowney white ink and apply it to all the areas where we will later be using the fluorescent paints. This is primarily the radioactive waste in the top of the vat, and also a couple of details on the sides, such as this little skull, where I will be later painting its eye with a fluorescent red. Once the chipping medium on the side panels is dry, I'm going to come in with Vallejo Game Air Black and just paint the entire side of each panel completely black. Now I'm going to apply Vallejo Sombre Gray to 2 of the alternating side panels, not all 4. And I'm doing this more from the top down, creating a little bit of a gradient so that the Sombre Gray is a bit brighter on the top and the black is a little bit darker on the bottom. I then use 10mm Tamiya masking tape to mask off stripes on the 2 unpainted panels. I also mix 2 parts Sombre Gray and 1 part Stonewall Gray, just to create a little bit of a highlight on the top of the side panels, because I wanted them to be a little bit brighter. So in order to paint the next part of the stripes yellow, yellow is a very transparent color and does not cover black very well. So to get yellow over black, I like to first apply a coat of Vallejo Leather Brown, which does go over black just fine, and then the yellow is able to adhere over the leather brown very easily. So now that the leather brown has been applied, we're taking Vallejo Sun Yellow, and as you can see, that sticks in just 1 or 2 coats over the leather brown. Now we'll take Vallejo Moon Yellow, and this I'm only applying to about the top, maybe 75% of each stripe. I'm leaving a little bit of the Sun Yellow at the bottom. Now I'm going to paint the eye on the skull with Green Stuff World Fluor Red. This is a very bright fluorescent paint, and as you can see, just building it up slowly makes an incredibly vibrant color, even more vibrant than the bright yellow that was sprayed directly next to it. So now that everything is dry, it's time for the incredibly satisfying process of removing the masking tape. And I probably didn't leave this to dry for quite as long as I should have, so in a few places the masking tape does pull up a small amount of paint, but that really doesn't matter because we're going to be coming in and chipping this all up anyways, so that you won't notice it at all. Or rather, it will just look like all the other paint chips on the model. So now that everything has dried fully and the masking tape has been removed, it's time to chip the paint away from the side panels. So I start by just giving it a spritz from a spray bottle and then taking a toothbrush and doing some of the preliminary rougher chipping just with the toothbrush. You'll also notice that the black chips a lot easier than the yellow does, and this is because the yellow has 3 more coats of paint on it than the black does. And this isn't an issue, it just means that to keep things consistent, you have to focus a little bit more on the yellow. Also, once I've done enough with the toothbrush, I switch to this random metal sculpting tool. You don't have to use something like this, you can use a toothpick or just anything. I just find that this works really well and sort of disrupt the pattern even more. I think the reason it's good to do weathering on caution tape is because it can sort of look sublimely perfect if you don't do anything to it, and so breaking up a few of those lines really makes it look a lot more realistic and a lot more interesting. So for the next step, this is the only part of the entire process where I'm going to use an actual brush. And for this I'm just using an old beat up brush that I normally use for dry brushing, But for this process, I'm actually not dry brushing. I would describe this process more as lightly stippling, because I'm not really dragging the bristles of the brush across the model. I'm just sort of dabbing on Vallejo Game Air Silver in places where I think it could use a little bit more visual interest. So this effect, you don't want to do it everywhere, and I tend to keep it sort of to the edges, just because that's generally where things realistically chip. But you can kind of do it anywhere, and as you can see, I'm just sort of picking my places carefully and applying it as I see fit. Also, go really slow with this step, because it's really easy to overdo this step. The silver is very bright, and if you put too much of it on, it can really overpower a lot of the other details. I would recommend going over the whole model very lightly first, and then if you think it could use a little bit more, come back through and add. You can always add more silver paint. It's very hard to take it away, especially at this step in the process. So as you can see, I'm just kind of coming in and just picking some of the edges. I put a little bit on the Mechanicum cog wheel on the side. And also, the consistency of my paint is a little bit wetter than dry brushing too, if that helps. Here I'm just putting a little bit on the side panels, but just be careful adding it to the side panels, as this effect really does look better when it's on the edges of things, as those tend to take a little bit more wear and tear than maybe the panels themselves. But just kind of do what you think looks good. There really is this is an art, not a science. One thing I also really like doing is any little details on the side panels, like this Mechanicum indent, or this little Mechanicum symbol that is cast on the side, pick that out with silver, as well as things like this little grate here up in the top left-hand corner, just to help the eye draw to the details that are on the side panels. Also, around the rim of the door is a good place to add a little bit of weathering. Around the hinges, where the door may have creaked and, wore away the rust and paint from the hinges. A little bit on the door itself. So now we come to the final step, which is to apply the Green Stuff World fluorescent paint to the radioactive waste in the top. I'll also just take a moment to mention that these Green Stuff World Fluor paints are my favorite paint. I believe it shows here on camera, but they are the most vibrant paints I have ever laid eyes on. They glow in just normal light. Like, they look fairly fluorescent even when you're not shining a black light on them, which makes them actually glow. So just keep that in mind, that if you want things to be really bright, almost unrealistically bright, try these Fluor paints out. You could also just use regular greens for this, like Elysian Green and Moot Green from Games Workshop. Those kind of mimic the color. They just don't have that same radiant fluorescent quality that these have. One thing to note too about the fluorescent paints is that they're extremely thin. So even though they have an unbelievable amount of color for such a thin paint, you really do have to build them up a lot in order to get their full effect. So now that we've built up a nice intense coat of that fluorescent green paint, we're going to go ahead and make it even brighter. So I'm coming back in with the Dollarani white ink and spraying on and around each of the bubbles, as well as creating a little bit of a blotchy pattern just on the surface of the liquid itself, just to stop the whole thing from being quite so uniform. Now I'm going to come in with another fluorescent paint, this time Fluor Yellow, and spray over all the white areas. The reason for putting down the white ink before spraying on the yellow is, as I mentioned before, these paints are incredibly transparent, so while you can build up the yellow over green, it takes a million coats and you don't even get a very bright yellow. In order to really build up these paints and create a difference between the two, you have to spray a coat of white first. I'm also spraying some of the yellow over some of the green, just to blend them together a little bit. And finally, I'm going to switch back to the Green Stuff World Fluor Lime, because the yellow can look a little bit stark when you just spray it over the white, so I'm just applying more of the green to blend them back together. After a coat of matte varnish, the model is complete, and here are a few shots of the finished product. This has been our very first YouTube video, so if you enjoyed, consider liking and subscribing, and moving forward we will be posting a video every week of the various miniature related projects that we're working on here in the studio, with the eventual goal of filming some games of Warhammer 40k and Age of Sigmar, once we've had time to build up a larger collection of terrain and miniatures. One last thing. As I mentioned earlier, these fluorescent paints glow under black light, so here's a shot of the model in complete darkness, illuminated by nothing but a black light. As you probably can't see, with the black light directly overhead, the green paint glows so brightly that this feeble camera can't even detect its full glory. But I assure you, it does look very cool in real life. Anyways, thanks for watching everyone, and I'll see you next time.